Brian Wilson was more than just a musician. He was an architect of sound, a builder of harmonies that seemed to float down from a higher place. When he and his brothers Dennis and Carl, along with their cousin Mike Love and friend Al Jardine, formed the Beach Boys in 1961, they were just kids from Hawthorne, California. They sang about surfing, cars, and girls. But underneath the simple lyrics was something revolutionary. Brian was the one behind it all. He was the composer, the arranger, the producer, and the quiet genius who heard entire symphonies in his head. He didn't just write songs, he built worlds out of music. The early hits came fast and furious. Surfin' USA, I Get Around, Fun, Fun, Fun. They were anthems for a generation, painting a picture of an endless summer where the sun always shone and the waves were always perfect. But Brian was already pushing beyond the formula. He was listening to Phil Spector and his Wall of Sound, and he wanted to create something even bigger, even more emotional. He wanted to take the raw energy of rock and roll and blend it with the complex, beautiful harmonies of vocal groups like the Four Freshmen. It was a sound that had never existed before, and it came pouring out of him. What made Brian truly special was his innate gift. He wasn't just good at music, he could hear every part of a song at once, the bass line, the drums, the layered vocals, the soaring strings, before a single note was ever played. In the studio, he was a gentle but firm conductor, guiding session musicians through his intricate arrangements with a quiet confidence. He used unconventional instruments, sleigh bells, harpsichords, and even the eerie theremin. He was a painter, using sounds instead of colors, and his canvas was the 3-minute pop song. He was building something that would last forever. This innovation reached its peak with the album and the single Good Vibrations. By then, Brian had stopped touring with the band, choosing to stay home and focus all his energy on the studio. He called Good Vibrations his pocket symphony. It was a masterpiece of production, pieced together from dozens of sessions in different studios. It was complex, strange, and breathtakingly beautiful. It changed what a pop song could be. Brian Wilson had not just created a new sound for the Beach Boys, he had created a new language for music itself, one that spoke of joy, innocence, and a deep, unspoken sadness. The California that Brian Wilson painted in his music was a paradise. It was a place of golden sands, roaring hot rods, and sun-bleached hair. This was the California of the American dream, a fantasy sold to the world through the speakers of a transistor radio. The songs were an invitation to a life of endless leisure and youthful freedom. For millions of people living in colder, grayer parts of the world, the Beach Boys' music was a ticket to a place they could only imagine. It was a powerful myth, and Brian was its chief storyteller. He sold the dream better than anyone. But Brian's own California was not the one he sang about. He was not a surfer, he was a homebody, more comfortable in a recording studio or his bedroom than on a beach. The sunny optimism of the lyrics often hid a deeper, more complicated reality. His father, Murray Wilson, was a demanding and often abusive figure, pushing his sons relentlessly toward success. The pressure to keep creating hits, to keep feeding the machine that was the Beach Boys, was immense. The idyllic world of the songs was an escape, a fantasy that Brian built for others, but one he could never quite inhabit himself. The music itself was a reflection of this duality. Listen closely to a song like In My Room. On the surface, it's about a teenager finding peace in his private space. But underneath there's a profound sense of loneliness and isolation. It's a song about retreat, about shutting out a world that is too loud and too demanding. This was the real Brian Wilson peeking through the curtain. He was a sensitive, gentle soul who felt things deeply, and the pressures of fame were beginning to take their toll. The California dream was a beautiful lie, and Brian was the one who knew its secret. Even at the height of their fame, the contrast between the image and the reality was stark. The band would be on tour, singing about the joys of surfing and driving while Brian was back in Los Angeles working obsessively in the studio, his mind racing with new musical ideas and haunted by growing anxieties. The sound he created was so bright it was almost blinding, but it was born from a place of shadow and doubt. The sun-kissed myth was powerful, but for the man who created it, the California sun cast a very long and very dark shadow. The pressure cooker of fame and family expectations began to boil over in the mid-1960s. Brian started experiencing panic attacks. On a flight to Houston in late 1964, he broke down completely, weeping in his seat. He told his bandmates he couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't handle the touring, the screaming crowds, the constant travel. He needed to stay home. He needed to focus on the music. It was a pivotal moment. While it freed him to create his masterpiece, Pet Sounds, it also marked the beginning of his long, slow withdrawal from the world. His mind, once a sanctuary of beautiful melodies, was becoming a prison. The whispers started soon after. Brian began hearing voices, auditory hallucinations that tormented him day and night. They were critical and menacing, telling him he was no good, that he was going to die. This was a symptom of the schizoaffective disorder that would plague him for the rest of his life. He tried to quiet the voices with drugs, marijuana, hashish, and eventually LSD. For a brief time, psychedelics seemed to unlock new creative doors, inspiring the cosmic explorations of the Smile album. But they also deepened his paranoia and destabilized his fragile mental state. The ambitious Smile project was meant to be his magnum opus, an album that would eclipse even the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper, but it became a symbol of his breakdown. As he struggled to assemble the fragmented pieces of music, his behavior grew more erratic. He built a sandbox in his living room, moving his piano into it so he could feel the sand beneath his feet while he composed. He became convinced that his music was causing fires to break out across Los Angeles. The voices grew louder, the paranoia more intense. The pressure from his bandmates who didn't understand his new musical direction was the final straw. Smile was shelved, and Brian retreated further into himself. The silence that followed was deafening. For much of the next decade, Brian Wilson, the boy genius of pop music, was a ghost. He spent years in his bedroom, sleeping, eating, and gaining weight, rarely leaving the house. He was a recluse, a cautionary tale whispered about in the music industry. The architect of the California dream was now living in a dark room, the curtains drawn against the sun. His brilliant mind, which had once soared with symphonies, was now under siege from within, trapped by echoes that only he could hear. Through the 1970s, Brian Wilson's creative light dimmed almost to nothing. He was a shadow in his own life, a passenger in the band he had once led with absolute authority. The Beach Boys continued to tour, playing their old hits to nostalgic crowds, but Brian was largely absent both physically and mentally. When he did appear, he was often a sad, bloated figure, his eyes vacant, his voice a ghost of its former self. He was lost in a fog of mental illness and drug abuse, a genius who had seemingly burned out, leaving behind only a legend and a collection of heartbreakingly beautiful songs. It was during this desperate time that a new figure entered Brian's life, Dr. Eugene Landy. A radical therapist with an unorthodox approach, Landy was hired by Brian's family in the mid-1970s to get him back on his feet. Landy's program was called 24-hour therapy. It was an aggressive, all-encompassing treatment that took complete control of Brian's life. Landy dictated what he ate, who he saw, and what he did every moment of the day. At first, it seemed to work. Brian lost weight, stopped using hard drugs, and started writing music again. But the savior soon revealed himself to be a controller. Landy isolated Brian from his family and friends, becoming the sole gatekeeper to the fragile star. He inserted himself into every aspect of Brian's career, demanding co-writing credits and a percentage of his earnings. He was no longer just a therapist, he was a business partner, a producer, and a collaborator. The line between treatment and exploitation became dangerously blurred. Brian was creating again, but was the music truly his? Or was it being coaxed out of him by a man who held all the power? This dark chapter lasted for years. Brian released his first solo album in 1988, simply titled. It contained moments of brilliance, but Landy's fingerprints were all over it. The family grew increasingly alarmed by Landy's control and his financial stake in Brian's life. They fought back, launching a legal battle to free Brian from his influence. It was a long and ugly fight, but eventually in 1992, a court order was issued, permanently barring Landy from contacting Brian Wilson ever again. Brian was free, but the years of manipulation had left deep scars. He had escaped one prison only to find himself facing the daunting task of rebuilding a life that had been controlled by others for so long. After the storm of the Landy years, a quiet calm began to settle over Brian Wilson's life. He reconnected with his family. He met Melinda Ledbetter, a car saleswoman he had briefly dated years before, and they married in 1995. Melinda became his rock, his advocate, and the steady hand that guided him through the complexities of daily life. With her support, Brian embarked on a second act that, honestly, few thought possible. He began to tentatively step back into the public eye, not as the mythical boy genius of the 60s, but as a survivor. A man who had been to hell and back and was learning to live again. The music returned, slowly at first. He started collaborating with other artists and working on new material. But, the biggest breakthrough came in 2004, when he finally decided to confront the ghost of his past. He assembled a new band and set out to complete and perform the legendary Lost album that had symbolized his breakdown nearly 4 decades earlier. It was a monumental undertaking, an act of incredible bravery. He was revisiting the most traumatic period of his life and wrestling it into submission, turning his greatest failure into a triumphant victory. The tour was an emotional experience for everyone involved, especially for Brian. On stage, he was often a fragile presence, sitting stiffly at his keyboard, his hands sometimes trembling. He rarely spoke to the audience, letting the music speak for him. But when he sang, the old magic was still there. The harmonies were as intricate and beautiful as ever. For fans, it was like witnessing a miracle. They weren't just hearing an album, they were watching a man reclaim his own story, rewrite his own ending. He was no longer defined by his breakdown, but by his resilience. This period became a renaissance for Brian. He toured the world, playing in its entirety. He released new albums. He was celebrated with Lifetime Achievement Awards and showered with the respect he had been denied for so long. He was still quiet, still shy, and the scars of his past were still visible. He was often surrounded by his band and his wife, a protective circle that allowed him to share his gift without being overwhelmed by the world. It was a fragile peace, but it was peace nonetheless. Brian Wilson had found a way to live with the echoes in his head, turning them back into music. As Brian Wilson entered his late 70s and early 80s, the years of struggle began to take a visible toll. The man who had survived so much was now facing a new, more insidious battle. His public appearances became less frequent, and when he was seen, he often appeared frail and disoriented. His wife and steadfast protector Melinda passed away in early 2024, a devastating blow that left him unmoored. Shortly after her death, his family revealed that Brian was suffering from a major neurocognitive disorder, the clinical term for dementia. The world that had always been a little too much for him was now slowly slipping away. He was placed under a conservatorship, a legal arrangement that echoed the control he had once endured under Eugene Landy. This time, however, it was designed to protect him, managed by his longtime publicist and manager, with the family's consent. But for a man whose life had been a fight for autonomy, it was a sad and ironic final chapter. The goal was to ensure he could remain in his home, surrounded by the people he loved, but it underscored the reality of his decline. The mind that had once constructed pop symphonies was now losing its ability to navigate the simplest of paths. Music, however, remained his last, most profound connection. Even as his memory and awareness faded, his emotional response to melody and harmony was intact. Reports from those close to him described how his face would light up when he heard one of his old songs, or how he could still sit at the piano and let his fingers find familiar, beautiful chords. It was the core of his being, the last part of him to go. The music was his first language and it would be his last. It was a lifeline to the person he had been, a tether to the world of beauty he had created. In his final months, he was described as exhausted. The long fight was coming to an end. The vibrant energy that had fueled his creative genius had been replaced by a deep weariness. The man who had given the world the sound of endless summer was now entering his own long winter. The music was still there, a soft echo in the quiet rooms of his house, but the architect himself was fading. The silence that had haunted him intermittently throughout his life was now gathering, preparing to fall for the last time. On the morning of June 11, 2025, Brian Wilson died at his home in Los Angeles. He was 82 years old. The news came via a brief statement from his family, posted on his official social media channels. It spoke of their profound heartbreak and celebrated him as their beloved patriarch and a national treasure. The statement cited natural causes as the reason for his death and asked for privacy during a time of mourning. It was a simple, dignified announcement for the end of a complex and tumultuous life. The world began to mourn the loss of a true musical visionary, but as the initial wave of sadness and tributes subsided, questions began to emerge. The official announcement was notably short on details. Natural causes is a broad term that can cover a multitude of possibilities, from a heart attack to complications from a long-term illness. For a public figure of Brian's stature, especially one with such a well-documented history of health problems and vulnerability, the lack of specificity felt strange. Fans and journalists began to wonder what exactly had happened in the final hours of his life. The quiet end seemed almost too quiet. The sense of mystery deepened when reports surfaced that an autopsy had been delayed. In many cases of an unattended death at home, An autopsy is a standard procedure to formally establish the cause. The delay, without any official explanation, fueled speculation. Was it a simple logistical issue, or was there something more to it? The silence from the family, while understandable in their time of grief, created a vacuum. In the absence of facts, theories began to circulate, whispered on social media, and discussed in hushed tones by those who had followed his life story so closely. The official narrative was simple. A beloved icon had passed away peacefully at an old age after a long illness. It was a gentle end to a life that had often been anything but gentle. But for many, it didn't feel like the whole story. The lack of information seemed to hint at complexities below the surface. The end of Brian Wilson's life was beginning to look a lot like his life itself, a beautiful, sad song with a few key notes missing, leaving the listener to wonder what they were and what they might have meant. The mystery surrounding Brian Wilson's death is not born from a single suspicious fact, but from a collection of whispers and shadows that echo his past. The most significant of these is the ghost of Eugene Landy. The memory of how easily Brian was controlled and exploited in the 1970s and 80s has left a permanent mark on his story. It created a precedent of vulnerability. Therefore, any lack of transparency about his well-being, even in his final days, naturally raises concerns. People ask, was he truly protected? Were his medications prescribed for his dementia managed correctly? These questions are not accusations but fearful echoes of a history that cannot be ignored. The delayed autopsy and the family's request for privacy, while normal on the surface, take on a different weight in this context. In a life marked by public battles and legal interventions, silence can feel unsettling. Unconfirmed rumors of disagreements within the family over his care and legacy in his final year only add to the uncertainty. Was everyone in agreement about his treatment? Was the conservatorship functioning as it should have? The absence of a clear, detailed statement from a coroner or a family spokesperson allows these questions to fester, turning a private family tragedy into a public puzzle. Then there is the nature of his illness itself. Dementia is a cruel and degenerative disease, but its progression varies. The announcement of his death came so soon after the passing of his wife, Melinda, that many have wondered about the emotional toll of her loss. Was his rapid decline a case of broken heart syndrome, a documented medical phenomenon where immense grief can lead to physical failure? Or were there other complications from his neurocognitive disorder that were not being publicly discussed? The vagueness of natural causes leaves all these possibilities open, allowing speculation to fill the void left by facts. Ultimately, the questions linger because Brian Wilson was never just a pop star, he was a symbol of fragile genius. His life was a public narrative of survival against incredible odds, against an abusive father, against mental illness, against exploitation. He was someone that people felt a deep need to protect. The mystery of his death is the final unresolved chord in his life's symphony. It feels as if the man who gave so much of his inner world to us in his music left without fully explaining the last page of his own story, leaving us to wonder if he was truly at peace. Brian Wilson's life was a study in contrasts. It was a story of soaring, sun-drenched harmonies and the deep, dissonant chords of pain that ran beneath them. He was the architect of the California dream and a prisoner of his own mind. He was a symbol of youthful innocence who carried the weight of adult trauma. He crafted music of pure, unadulterated joy while battling profound sadness. This fundamental duality is the key to understanding both his genius and his struggles. His art was not an escape from his pain, it was a conversation with it. The mystery surrounding his death is, in a way, a fitting final chapter to this story. His life was filled with unanswered questions and periods of silence, from the lost years in his bedroom to the whispered secrets of the sessions. He was a man who was often misunderstood, whose inner world was so complex that it was impossible for outsiders to fully grasp. The lack of a clear, simple answer to how he died feels consistent with a life that was never clear or simple. It leaves us where we so often were with Brian on the outside, listening intently, trying to understand. His legacy is not just in the hit songs or the groundbreaking production techniques, it is in the emotional honesty he embedded in his music. In a song like God Only Knows, you can hear both the profound love and the terrifying vulnerability of giving your heart to someone else. In Surf's Up, you can hear the hope for a better world tangled with the cynical despair of a broken one. He taught us that pop music could be high art, that it could contain the full spectrum of human experience, from the highest highs to the lowest lows. So, while the questions about his final days may never be fully answered, perhaps they are not the most important part of his story. Brian Wilson's life was not about the destination but about the journey. It was a journey of immense creativity, debilitating illness, profound love, and incredible resilience. The final silence is just that, silence. But the music he left behind is a resounding, eternal harmony. It is a testament to a beautiful, troubled soul who heard a symphony in his head and against all odds, found a way to share it with